The extent to which you think Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band is the greatest album ever made probably has a lot to do with how old you are. Like all things made by fallible human beings, the album isn't perfect. It has its boring moments, and not every song is appealing to every kind of listener. But when Sgt. Pepper was originally released, no one was thinking about the flaws. They were simply blown away by the level of creativity on display. The album still has an aura of critical reverence around it to this day, but as the years have gone by, general interest in it has slowed down to the point where it's no longer canonically the greatest album ever in most people's eyes. It's not even the best Beatles album to a lot of people. But what makes Sgt. Pepper unique is the universality of its appeal. It's diverse without being random, unlike the White Album. The lyrics are clever without being pretentious, unlike Magical Mystery Tour. The music is experimental while still largely conforming to the characteristic Beatles style that longtime fans would have missed if it had been absent. It gave both the old-timers and new fans pretty much everything they could have wanted, as well as some things they didn't expect at all. And that, in case you were wondering where I was going with all this, is what Sgt. Pepper has in common with the original Metroid Prime. Whether or not you think Metroid Prime is the best game in the trilogy, or maybe even the best game period, also probably has a lot to do with how old you are, and particularly whether or not you played other Metroid games before it. Fans of the original 2D entries in the series tend to rate it substantially above its own sequels, because both structurally and atmospherically, Prime has the most in common with those older entries. It takes full advantage of its three-dimensional setting, but it uses that setting to make you explore and tease out the way forward in a very similar fashion to how you would in Super Metroid. But also, just like Super Metroid, Metroid Prime can be really confusing. This is one of the biggest criticisms Mark Brown had for the game, and he's right that there's multiple sections in the game where it's very difficult to figure out exactly what you're supposed to do, unless you use the hint system, which pretty much sucks all the challenge out of exploration. Where I think this criticism goes wrong is his apparent assumption that this is a departure for the Metroid series, when in fact it's basically what the series had always done. Mark's comparison of the section after the grapple beam in Prime to the more focused design of Super Metroid and Brinstar may seem like an indictment of Prime's design, until you realize that he's comparing apples and oranges. The section of Brinstar he's referring to is a place you explore about an hour into Super Metroid. Of course there aren't hundreds of rooms to explore at this point. You haven't even been in hundreds of rooms yet. The equivalent part of Metroid Prime to this would be near the end of the player's first visit to the Chozo Ruins, a very self-contained part of the game during which it's nearly impossible to get lost, and just before the first visit to Magmoor Caverns, which as he points out is almost completely linear. Prime at this point in the game isn't any more confusing or aimless than Super Metroid. In fact, arguably it's less. Meanwhile, the grapple beam is the third-to-last major upgrade in Prime, found near the end of the game. The area that's most comparable to this section of Prime isn't Brinstar at all. It's Meridia, a terribly confusing and frustrating section near the end of Super Metroid, which is notorious for getting players totally lost. Judged by the same standards he's applying to Prime, Super Metroid also fails to point you in the right direction on many occasions, assuming that this is a failure and not part of the challenge, a question that Mark seems pretty ambivalent about. But there's another thing that he misses in his analysis of Metroid Prime's structure, something that would solve a lot of his problems with the game if only he paid more attention to it. This is a feature that's all over Prime and its sequels, and yet I rarely see people talking about it or the profound effect it has on the series' gameplay and story. In fact, it's the first tool you have to use the very first time you have control of the game, the Scan Visor. Scanning objects is the defining feature of the entire Metroid Prime series, the thing that sets it apart from almost all other first-person shooters, and yet it gets surprisingly short shrift from critics when they discuss Metroid Prime. This is probably because the way you interact with it is by reading text, which is something a lot of players find boring. Text doesn't really take advantage of the multimedia aspect of games. It slows the pace of action to a crawl, and it just seems old-fashioned and boring to a lot of people. I happen to love reading flavor text, and even I'll admit that choosing to scan everything in the game can feel pretty ridiculous sometimes. You walk into a room teeming with hidden enemies waiting to pounce on you, the battle music swells, and then instead of fighting, you spend 5 minutes staring at computer screens that tell you what the space pirates had for lunch that day. I always felt that the Scan Visor made Samus feel more cerebral and calculating, but I can see how for some players this goes over the edge and makes her seem like an obsessive-compulsive weirdo who just has to stop in the middle of whatever she's doing to spy on enemies who already know she's there. However, looking at the Prime series from the perspective of storytelling, it's obvious that the Scan Visor is the primary, and often the only, way that the game tells its story to you. I mentioned in the introduction that Metroid Prime doesn't really have characters, even though the pirates and the Chozo are sort of like stand-ins for actual characters. In much the same way, Metroid Prime doesn't have a story in the sense of a series of dramatic on-screen events that the protagonist participates in. What it has instead is a mood, a kind of atmospheric personality that changes as you move through the world of Tallon IV. So I'm going to take you on a little tour through the campaign of Metroid Prime, looking at it not as a series of puzzles and fights, but as a drama that reveals itself, as Hitchcock suggested, by giving the audience information a little bit at a time. On the way, we'll see how Prime, in its own way, set up a pretty solid premise for a prospective trilogy, despite the simplicity of its story. Not that its sequels did the best job of following up on that, but still. A lot of people treat this introductory sequence as a glorified tutorial, which comes off well principally from being 1, short, and 2, hands-off. And as tutorials go, Prime's is certainly easy to get down, as it were, unlike, say, Twilight Princess's, which is often cited as an example of wasting the repeat player's time. But if you pay attention to your surroundings and scan carefully, you'll find that this section is more than a tutorial. In a way, it's a microcosm of the entire game, and even the whole series, one which introduces the threat of Phazon as subtly, but effectively, as it informs you how to shoot your arm cannon and roll into a morph ball. This is the first place in the game where you'll see references to Phazon, and the Space Pirates' experimentation on the organisms of Tallon IV. Both the massive damage to the vessel and your first boss fight against the Parasite Queen in the reactor core demonstrate the fact that Phazon is capable of mutating species entirely beyond recognition, and making them uncontrollably violent. In fact, the word uncontrollable is a good summary of Phazon in general. Even the methodical and intelligent space pirates are barely able to keep up with its mutagenic powers over the course of the first game, and in subsequent installments it's obvious that Phazon is using them more than they're using it. This is foreshadowed by the state of the frigate right at the beginning of the game. Samus hasn't done anything to the space pirates yet, but one of their ships is already a total wreck thanks to Phazon, with the entire crew either dead or mortally wounded. Except Ridley, but he's a special case. This situation, by the way, is also a neat case of gameplay dovetailing with story. Even ordinary space pirates are among the tougher enemies to fight in Prime, but the state of their ship at the beginning of the game makes it plausible that they would be weakened, and therefore easier to fight. It lets the game ease the player into combat while still making Samus's major antagonist prominent from the beginning of the game. The other important story/gameplay detail that happens here is, of course, the infamous elevator explosion, which deprives Samus of most of her abilities immediately after the tutorial. As many people have pointed out, it feels a little contrived, and more importantly from my standpoint, they don't really do anything with it dramatically. Samus just happens to lose all her powers, and oh look, there happen to be identical suit upgrades scattered over the planet she lands on. Echoes actually did a much better job with this same idea, but you could argue it loses points for rehashing it, no matter how well the rehash turned out. Anyway, after the frigate explodes and crash lands on Tallon IV, we move to the Tallon overworld. This section is a breather after the high-intensity opening, and arguably the only story element here, which you may or may not stumble upon at this point, is the Space Pirates' message about the impact crater and the Chozo temple built on it. Speaking of the Chozo... The Chozo Ruins is the first major area you explore in Metroid Prime, and also the first to begin laying out the backstory of Tallon IV and what happened on it. Thematically, this is one of the more important areas of the game, and one that many players have fond memories of. One thing that I didn't notice about the Ruins the first time I played is that it's actually the highest region on the map. It's a little weird for Metroid that the first elevator in the game takes you up rather than down. I guess I assumed that Ruins would be buried deep within the planet, not to mention that the place you're coming from is called the Tallon Overworld. But really, the Chozo are basically bird people, so it makes perfect sense that they would want to live high up. This also may explain why, despite the pirates' obvious interest in Chozo artifacts and technology, they never make it up here to start poking around, even though there's a higher density of Chozo stuff here than anywhere else. The absence of the pirates, the main antagonists of Prime, from this place is an important detail. There's an emphasis on puzzle solving and wayfinding in the Ruins rather than combat, which tends to come to the forefront in the Phendrana Drifts, and especially in the Phazon Mines. This area is relaxing, and the lore makes you think about the planet's past, rather than what's happening right now. In your first visit to the Ruins, the Chozo lore talks about their origins in Tallon IV, and only briefly touches on the effects of the meteor impact which destroyed them. You might also notice that Phazon only exists here as a nebulous influence. The big corruption here is the poisoned water coming from Flagra, which is swept away once you defeat it. Just as the devastation on the pirate frigate is a microcosm of the game's central conflict, the first visit to the Chozo Ruins is like a microcosm of Samus's eventual victory over Phazon. She discovers a deadly poison, identifies its source, and terminates it, restoring life to the wasteland. You feel triumphant for other reasons, too. The Chozo Ruins gives you more major upgrades more quickly than any other area of the game. Within an hour, Samus has already recovered missiles, the Morph Ball, bombs, and the Variasuit. This is arguably the part of the game that's most fun to play a second time, which is good since it's also the most linear. It would be tedious to slog through otherwise. And having slogged through it, we make our way onward to the Magmoor Caverns. Mark was very critical of the Magmoor Caverns in his video on Metroid Prime. He basically said that it was the worst section of the game because you had to traverse it so many times over the course of the game. He did overlook one important thing, though. While you're going through this area multiple times, you don't cover exactly the same ground all those times. In fact, the first 3 times you visit the caverns, you're moving through an entirely new part of the map, which means it's really not that repetitive unless you visit it when you don't actually have to. Another thing that makes his criticism seem harsher than is warranted is that Magmoor is really easy to traverse. Even going from one end of it to the other, which you never have to do, would only take you about 10 minutes tops. What Magmoor Caverns really is, when you get right down to it, is a second hub region, like the Tallon overworld. But why would we need 2 hubs, you ask? Isn't the whole point of a hub that it leads to all parts of the map? But Metroid Prime isn't designed that way. By the midway point, when you pass through the crashed frigate, the Tallon overworld is a lot bigger and more complicated to get around, and at that point it stops serving as an effective hub. Magmoor Caverns essentially takes its place as the area you go to when you want to move around. Because it's a hub world, Magmoor also has very little to offer in the way of story. The space pirates have an outpost here, but it's minor and doesn't involve any Phazon research. There are no really threatening enemies and nothing really scary going on. Mood-wise, the first visit here is a break after the heavy atmosphere of the Chozo Ruins, just as the first visit to the Tallon overworld let you relax after the tension-filled pirate frigate. In fact, even when you head to Phendrana, the mood is still largely the same. There's very little lore in this section as you move toward the boost ball, which leads us back to the Tallon overworld and the space jump boots. The acquisition of the space jump marks a major turning point in Metroid Prime, in terms of both gameplay and atmosphere. Many new areas are opened up by the ability to double jump, and this leads the player to explore more of Phendrana Drifts. At this point, the plot of Metroid Prime, such as it is, has been dormant for more than an hour. It's the longest stretch of the game where no major new thematic element has been introduced. All that is about to change. Upon returning to Phendrana, combat becomes a much bigger part of Metroid Prime, and non-combat challenges largely shift from puzzle-solving to platforming with Samus's expanded moveset through much larger rooms. This is arguably where the real game begins. Before we reach the pirate lab, of course, we have to get the wave beam. The Sheegoth, which protects it, is the first really difficult boss battle in the game, what some people refer to as a wake-up call boss, and once you obtain the wave beam, it sees a lot of use right away. Mark criticized the use of beam doors in Prime as being more or less a fake puzzle, since the map always tells you which doors are opened by which beam. Personally, I don't mind this. It's true that Super Metroid had doors that could only be opened by super missiles and power bombs and so on, and it didn't tell you which were which on the map. But then again, it also had a lot fewer doors of this type. And when you get right down to it, they were kind of a pain in the ass. I'm not at all sorry that the developers of Prime left this type of puzzle out of the game. It has more than enough puzzles, including exploration-based ones, as it is. Samus's invasion of Glacier One after obtaining the wave beam could be seen as the first real plot point in Metroid Prime. After hours of preparation, Samus is invading the space pirates' home turf, hoping to foil their evil plans like she always has before. And the pirates certainly notice it. Later on in the game, you'll read many references to the Hunter and the pirates' well-founded fear of her. Gameplay-wise, this part of the game features a sudden and honestly pretty awkward shift into full-on action combat. Prime isn't the smoothest shooter in the world, and fights against space pirates can wear your trigger finger out quite quickly. Luckily for me, combat is not the only interesting thing we find here. The player learns 2 plot-critical pieces of information during the invasion of the pirate lab. The first is that the pirates are using Phazon to experiment on Metroids. There's even a cutscene of Samus examining a Metroid in a holding tank, something that probably surprised her since the Metroids were presumed destroyed after the events of Metroid 2. Of course, if you read all the scans on the Frigate Orpheon, you would already know that the pirates smuggled some Metroids out with them, but the game can't assume that you have that knowledge, hence the cutscene. The other important thing to be found in the pirates' data logs is that Ridley is both alive and more powerful than he was before. You've already had a chance to see Ridley twice, once on the frigate and once flying overhead on Tallon IV. But this confirms that Samus's most feared enemy is at large and probably looking for her. The pirates also describe Phazon as an energy source so powerful that they will probably never see anything like it again. When you consider the uses that space pirates put their energy toward, this is a pretty concerning thing, on top of Phazon's mutagenic properties. Another disturbing fact is found in the description of Tallon IV in the Pirates' Observatory. It indicates that the planet, which the player has seen as a blasted wasteland, was once a paradise teeming with life, and that this change happened in less than a decade. If the player hasn't taken the impact of the meteor which caused all this seriously up to now, this is a good reason to reconsider, especially considering that the same data log claims that all life on the planet will likely be extinct in less than a quarter of a century. Now at this point, the player has already seen Chozo lore claiming that the Great Poison will destroy Tallon IV, but the way that Chozo described this is very mystical and vague, and it's entirely possible that the player might not believe in the literal truth of what they're saying. One interesting implication of the massive differences between the characterizations of the Chozo and the pirates is that, since they disagree on so much, anything they agree on is probably true. The space pirates are anything but mystical. They're very pragmatic and ruthless, so when they say that Phazon is destroying the planet, you can take that to the bank. For the last hour, the player has been engaged in virtually non-stop combat, starting with the Sheegoth boss fight through the pirate encounters in the lab, and finally the Thardus boss fight after obtaining the thermal visor. Heading back to the Chozo Ruins to find the ice beam brings the energy level down again, and reorients the game toward puzzle solving. When we first visited the ruins, the Chozo lore was mostly about their life on Tallon IV, and the meteor impact that brought Phazon to the planet. The lore that we find in this section, by contrast, focuses a lot more on the present. The Chozo describe themselves as ghosts dragged back to the world of the living, dimly perceiving what's going on, but being powerless to stop it. At the same time, they describe visions of Samus arriving to save their home and avenge them. Whether this is some kind of prophecy, or the Chozo literally seeing Samus's activity as she does it, is uncertain. But to the Chozo, this is the first hope they've had since the crash that the Great Poison will be stopped. There's a hint of optimism here that tempers the generally bleak and depressing tone of the rest of the game. It's worth remembering at this point that Samus was raised by Chozo, not specifically the ones who live here, but they're aware of her upbringing. They call her a hatchling, someone who culturally is as much Chozo as she is human, which in a way makes her the last of her kind. Given this, the fact that she curls up into a ball to interact with the Chozo statues, like the one here in the Hall of the Elders, is almost touching. It's like a child seeking comfort in her parents' arms, and I don't think the similarity is unintentional. Now, neither the idea of Samus curling up in the Chozo statues, or the theme of both good and bad creatures going extinct, is unique to Metroid Prime. But this was the first entry where the Chozo had a voice to talk about their relationship with Samus, and the feelings that go along with it. There's always been an implicit sadness related to Samus's departed youth among the Chozo. Prime makes it explicit for the first time in the series. The trip to Phendrana's Edge is largely unremarkable from a story perspective. It's an interesting area visually, but neither the pirates or the Chozo are doing anything important here. The sole point of interest from a story perspective is the sudden arrival of Hunter Metroids, whose evolution has been altered by the presence of Phazon. Once the gravity suit is obtained, however, we're ready to move through the most powerfully atmospheric area in the game. The crashed pirate frigate is a unique set piece in the history of the Prime trilogy, as well as Metroid as a whole. This is a place the player has already explored, but warped into an unrecognizable and eerie form. It sort of anticipates the light world, dark world concept of Echoes, except that the changes that happen to the frigate are much more realistic, which to me makes them scarier. Anyone who's looked at photos of sunken ships probably knows what I'm getting at. The one discordant note is the presence of the Aqua Pirates. Fighting enemies here detracts from the lonely and haunting atmosphere of the place, and the last thing Prime needed at this point was more combat against enemies who are virtually identical to the ubiquitous flying pirates. In any case, the moment when you re-emerge from the frigate into a totally new part of the Tallon overworld is a memorable one. The giant tree that forms the basis of this room had me in awe when I played as a kid. It reminds you that no matter what either the Chozo or the pirates have done, Tallon IV was an amazing planet to begin with, and must have been beautiful before the Phazon meteor hit. In an odd way, this room reminds you what's at stake in this conflict. The Phazon Mines are basically Glacier One on steroids. There's more difficult combat here, as well as more extreme examples of the pirates' experimentation with Phazon, notably the elite pirates. The structure of this level, at least on the first visit, is also very similar. Samus invades a pirate research facility, catching them off guard, grabs an important upgrade, then fights her way out against considerably increased opposition. One wrinkle in both the gameplay and story here is the Wave Trooper, the first of a series of beam pirates who use reverse-engineered versions of your weapons. This varies the combat by making you rely on beams you might not use much otherwise, but it also underlines an aspect of the space pirates' character that makes them effective villains, their ruthless inquisitiveness and adaptability. The pirates have already learned how your beams work after seeing them in action only a few times. In the case of the ice beam, they may never have seen you use it, period. Science team may have vapor for brains, but all things considered, they do a pretty bang-up job. The fact that the pirates can copy Chozo technology in the first place is a little scary. Samus's Chozo tech is the one thing that gives her an edge in fights against the pirates. This is also a plot point that makes them feel more human. You get to see their envy of Samus's cool stuff, their frustration with repeated failed attempts to replicate her morph ball, which is also kind of funny, and their fear at the prospect of losing an arms race with their greatest enemy. Things like this are what make the pirates feel like a character, despite the fact that none of them is ever given a personal identity. After obtaining the power bombs, grapple beam, and X-ray visor, the player is now ready for the endgame of Metroid Prime. This is the time to fully explore most of the map and pick up any spare upgrades as well as the rest of the artifacts. By the way, about those artifacts, Mark complained in his video that the backtracking needed to find the Chozo artifacts was tedious, and that the player might not even know the artifacts are important until late in the game. I agree with the first part of his criticism. The first time I played Metroid Prime, the artifact hunt at the end was quite a slog, although it's always fun using the plasma beam to effortlessly torch enemies who used to kick you around. The second part, by contrast, gets to the heart of what this video is all about. It is true that if you pay no attention to any of the lore, and don't try to explore the Artifact Temple until you absolutely have to, the entire Artifact subplot comes across as pointless and forced. But you have to ask yourself a question. Is it actually fun to play Metroid Prime that way? The developers put the Scan Visor in, and made it central to progression for a reason. They wanted you to be curious and look around for clues. You can get into the Artifact Temple, grab the first artifact, and be given clues about the locations of several others as soon as you beat the first mini-boss in the Chozo Ruins, although realistically the player would be more likely to come back just before going to the Magmoor Caverns. Given that, if you never go back to your ship and peek into the temple that's right next to it until there's literally nothing else to do, is that actually the game's fault? Metroid Prime is a game about exploration. There's simply no way to make a game like that without backtracking, and the developers of Prime expected you to backtrack even more than is strictly necessary because you'd have to figure out where to go. It seems to me that they expected you to stumble across the Artifact Temple early, and then, having realized that the impact crater was the source of the Phazon, from reading scans, you would revisit it multiple times to get info on the remaining artifacts. This whole thing reminds me of the frustration I used to get watching Aaron Hansen play games on Game Grumps. Aaron is a funny guy, but as a gamer he has one serious flaw that makes it hard to watch him. He has no patience for anything that is not gameplay. More than once, Aaron would blow through all the dialogue and in-game signs intended to tell you what's happening, and then later complain that the game is confusing. Of course it's confusing, Aaron, because you're not paying attention. Whew. Sorry you had to see that. Actually, Mark's attitude here reminds me a lot more of the argument, which I've heard way too often, that you have to bomb every square in Metroid to progress. This has never been true, and it reflects a profound disinterest in the actual design of the rooms. If you pay attention, you'll know where to bomb the vast majority of the time, particularly when it involves progression and not just optional upgrades. And in the same way, if you scan important objects in Metroid Prime and spend just a little time thinking about the design of the environment, you'll generally know where you have to go, even if you miss a few missile expansions on the way. The lower portion of the Phazon Mines is one of two truly alien and frightening sections of Metroid Prime, the other being the trip through the crashed frigate. I'm leaving out the impact crater because it's so short. For one thing, this place is really dark, with neither the thermal visor nor the X-ray visor providing a totally comfortable view. The X-ray visor is great for platforming, but it makes it difficult to see the Metroids, who you definitely do not want sneaking up on you. The thermal visor lets you see the Metroids really well, but it's terrible for the difficult platforming in this section. In practice, this is the single most stressful area in the game. It's also the most linear, with just one straight path heading directly for the Omega Pirate. This boss is the thematic culmination of the two biggest threats in Metroid Prime, space pirate science and the power of Phazon. It's the most powerful bioweapon the pirates have ever come up with. They didn't invent Metroids, after all. And not surprisingly, this is a very tough and intimidating boss fight, especially when what seems like an entire army of beam pirates shows up to defend the boss. Even the thrill of victory is somewhat tainted here, as Samus is swept by a wave of Phazon and finds her own suit corrupted by it into the Phazon suit. This idea of a dangerous but necessary infusion of Phazon is something that Corruption would expand massively on. But that's for another video. Heading back to the impact crater to take on the Phazon at its source, we find ourselves intercepted by Samus's persistent nemesis, Ridley. For a good 2/3 of the game, the observant player has known that Ridley was alive and spoiling for a fight, but it was easy to forget that with everything else that was going on. Now that foreshadowing pays off with one of the most thrilling and challenging boss fights in Metroid history. Meta Ridley may not be the final boss of the game, but in my opinion, he's the hardest. This fight killed me more times than I can count when I first played Prime. However, atmospherically, this fight is actually kind of relaxing. Meta Ridley is fought out in the open, and he's not Phazon enhanced, just agile and physically powerful, as he's always been. He's not mutated or disgusting, unlike the Omega Pirate, whose fight I always found to be more unsettling and unpleasant, even when I was winning. Thematically, this fight serves as a reminder that, Phazon or no Phazon, the space pirates are a serious threat to galactic peace. Since Phazon isn't involved here, it also points to the continuity of the series, the fact that the threat posed by the space pirates will almost certainly outlive Samus's victory over them on Tallon IV. Once Meta Ridley is defeated, there's nothing left to do but enter the impact crater, get harassed by a few Metroids, and make our way to the final boss. Metroid Prime is kind of like a mirror image of the Omega Pirate. He was the product of the space pirates using Phazon, just as they've used Metroids in the past. Metroid Prime, on the other hand, is a Phazon-created monster using appropriated pirate technology, as explained in several, now unfortunately retconned, lore entries describing the pirates' attempts to control it. Prime is both alien and unpredictable, leading to a chaotic and very unnerving fight that felt worse than Ridley, even though it's ultimately easier to gain the upper hand. Samus ultimately defeats Metroid Prime by using the Phazon beam to overload it with power. The idea of an enemy that's so powerful that only its own power can defeat it is not something Prime invented, but it's used very subtly here in a way that makes sense. Corruption would take this much further, painting Phazon infection as both wrenchingly painful and insidiously tempting. But here Samus is freed from her Phazon suit by the last struggle of a dying Metroid Prime as it melts into a puddle of Phazon. It's important to remember in all this that Metroid Prime is not a story-focused game. As I've said before, the game barely has a plot, and its story is more suggested than actually laid out. What makes Prime exceptional is not the complexity of its story, but the unique way in which it tells that story. The level of detail that it goes into is entirely in the player's hands. If you choose, you can make Prime into a bare-bones pretext for exploration that closely resembles the non-plot of earlier games in the series. But on the other hand, if you enjoy the game's lore, it has enough richness to reward examination. Depending on your level of engagement with the story, Prime is either about Samus's exploration of a deserted planet filled with puzzles and combat challenges, or it's about the cataclysmic events that nearly annihilated Tallon IV, the noble Chozo who fought back against the corruption but ultimately succumbed to it, and the power-hungry space pirates who thought they could use Phazon to gain power, but who in the end were decimated by the very forces they sought to control. By intertwining the Scan Visor so thoroughly with Prime's gameplay, Retro also succeeded in making a fundamental change to Samus as a character. From the beginning of the series, Samus was portrayed as strong and courageous, but Prime made her whip-smart as well, just as comfortable with computers and science as she was with alien bugs and massive explosions. This was a Samus who not only had to fight on her feet, but think on her feet as well. More than any other game in the series, Metroid Prime gave us Samus as most players recognize her today. I compared Metroid Prime to Sgt. Pepper earlier, but maybe a better comparison, given its place in a trilogy, is the first Star Wars movie, now retrospectively titled A New Hope. One thing that I've rarely heard people discuss is that the original Star Wars works perfectly well as a self-contained movie. It may have enabled the creation of a trilogy, but it didn't actually need its 2 sequels to feel complete. The story begins with galactic rebels smuggling plans to destroy the Empire's dreadful, planet-disintegrating weapon, and it ends with them destroying it. Every character has an arc, and the story covers a wide range of emotional tones. It feels complete. Metroid Prime also feels complete. It starts with the menace of Phazon and Tallon IV as a barren wasteland, and by the end, Samus has contained the threat and restored life to the planet. Prime already provided, in one game, everything that Metroid fans could possibly want and more. No surprise, then, that to many people it's still the purest and best-designed game of the trilogy, even if its sequels have other charms. And I don't think anyone, not even the team at Retro, could have predicted where the series was headed from here.